And we go on the next panel with the exciting topic, smart technology in the hands of a few. I think a very important debate for the following reason. When we talk about artificial intelligence, very often the question is, are we ruled by technology? Does it get out of hand, out of control? How do we deal with technology? Can we trust it? Important questions. It's always about the relationship between artificial intelligence and human beings. You neglect the fact that AI is used in a context where data are afforded a new economic role, where they become economically important and enable new kinds of company, tech companies, digital platforms. And we want to talk about those links between AI as a technology and economic change, changes in the economic system, changes which have an impact on society, and that is to do with the new role of data and the companies which want to consider those data as an asset. Two guests, Jeanette Hofmann is a professor of Internet policies at the Free University of Berlin. She works at the Science Center in Berlin and at the Weizenbaum Center. She's in charge of a very lively project group, Politics of Digitization, and she's a spokesperson on digitization at Leopoldina. Jeanette, you have looked into the internet for ages. How come? Are you a bit of a tech hound? Answer: I've always been mildly interested in technology, but as far as the internet is concerned, well, the Science Center in Berlin in '92 got access to the internet. Somebody entered the room and said, this is your account. And that's it. That was before the World Wide Web. It was black and white back then. I'd never heard about it. And two women at my department where I worked decided, well, let's have a closer look at that. And then we were lost. The next weeks, we didn't do anything else. The next 15, 20 years. So it was a smart idea and an exciting decision. Just like Timo Daum, who for a long time has dealt with issues to do with the digital capitalism. He is an author, publishes very exciting books on a wide array of issues. I've heard he is an online designer and a teacher of IT informatics or economic informatics. He is also at the Science Center in Berlin. He is a visiting scientist. He is part of the family. Timo, you are online designer and an author of so many books. How do you manage? Online designer, that was in the past, is the answer. But I could tell you a similar story. The first email I sent to a friend in the US before the World Wide Web existed, that was the trigger, and I've been captured by the internet ever since. Project management, programming, I did lots of jobs before I became an author and before I published books on this issue. So we've all caught the bug. This would have been true for Svea Windwehr, who had to cancel. She's ill. At Google, she is responsible for public policy. It would have been exciting to have her here, not to talk about platforms, but with a representative of a platform. So get better soon. I'm quite excited. My first offline event in front of a large audience. I'm Florian Butollo. I'm also at the Science Center in Berlin for social research at the Weizenbaum-Institut. I'm in charge of the working group, highly automated processes, and also member of a working group on artificial intelligence. This is what I had wanted to say by words of introduction. Timo, digital capitalism, this is what you mention time and again. Is it just a label? label you attach to capitalism? Or have we reached a new quality here? And what are platforms to do with that? Answer: digital capitalism. Well, I'm very happy that we talk about capitalism and AI. This is one of the most important machines. This is the locomotive, the engine of digital capitalism. When we talk about digital capitalism, we focus on a society, not an information society, mind, or late modern society, but about capitalism, a system where the core or the heart is capital, which wants to grow, and that for 150 or 200 years in our latitudes. At the same time, capitalism reinvents itself in its search for higher profits. It mutates and is similar to the virus we have been pestered with for a few years. So digital capitalism is like the delta mutant of capitalism. And the adjective digital, that doesn't refer to intangible, virtual, nothing to do with hardware or infrastructure or an industrial basis, in a vacuum, in a metaverse. On the contrary, we know the internet is one of the biggest power consumers in the world, one of the biggest consumers of resources, so that promise has not been kept. But the adjective means the principle has changed. The generation, the growth via networks has become the center of economic and societal efforts. For this new kind of machinery, platforms, as it were, are the factories, you could say, are the factories of digital capitalism. And those are infrastructures consisting of hardware and software, which have been designed by companies in order to perfectly organize digital value creation. And the analogy is right with factories. Industrial capitalism erected factories to assemble workers, resources, in order to optimize its model of exploitation. And the analogy reaches very far. The platforms are the cathedrals of digital capitalism, where billions go in order to be exploited through our activities for revenue production, as Karl Marx put it, to make a contribution to that. This is my answer. So the delta mutant, I hope it's not the ugliest mutant of capitalism. We will discuss that. Jeanette, what do you say? This strange concentration of power which we experience in digital platforms, do you see that as a dominating principle? And how come that we have this kind of concentration of power? Answer: I think you can say platforms are an important organizational principle of a digital society. This is not an economic point of view, economic angle, but as a sociologist, so to speak, that I would say platforms are a crucial mechanism of integration. A mechanism of integration because given the differences, there are similarities as well, namely they are all matchmakers. They create links, connections between people and organizations which under different circumstances would not have met, at least not quite to this extent. For smaller companies, which with little capital only, they get markets, sales markets, they generate customers, acquire customers at the other end of the world, which otherwise wouldn't have happened. And for communication platforms, it's social relationships between people. which are fostered by the platforms. And for lots of users, besides exploitation, no two ways about that, has a big added value for society. We benefit a lot from those platforms, and hence we all participate. We are not forced to. We do it voluntarily. My question, to bring it to a head, well, nobody forced us to work in a factory. The necessity to sell our labor, as Karl Marx put it, and the salaried worker, and this was progress in capitalism, compared to servants in feudalism, for instance, to serfs in feudalism. Well, the analogy goes this far. Today's platforms, well, we enter them voluntarily. We can decide against it to participate in Facebook or TikTok. And still, not so much maybe for us, maybe in certain situations and industries, the obligation to participate. Well, this is a social, societal space which has been created, and the constraint and the obligation to participate, well, it's there. It's societal spaces, but designed from scratch by private companies. And like a factory, the biggest car factory in the world in Wolfsburg was designed for the production of cars and for higher profits of the company which built the factory. The same is true for the design of platforms. From the bottom up, it has one aim: to make the owners richer, to generate more profits for the owners. But as it is a societal space, this is even a bigger problem compared to if it were a golf course, which hasn't such an importance for society. For me, it's a difference whether I sell my labor, I have to do it. If I don't have my own country to grow my own potatoes and carrots, or if I use a platform. There is a difference, but you are right. Especially among the young generation, not using those platforms would lead to social marginalization, because everybody else is participating, and that is correct. But it's a different kind of force, a different kind of obligation, so to speak, or constraint. But this is not just an economic relationship. Platforms create a kind of society which people are interested in and which people like. You should consider that. We should mention that. The owners of the platforms, and you are right in that, they design the platforms in such a way that they gain a maximum amount of data, but this is not really anything to do with the intention of the users. A communication platform like Twitter, if I use Twitter, well, I do it because it's fun, I like it. At which point does the platform become a problem, because it can lead to users becoming addicted? I think Svea had found similar arguments. I go to a factory because I need to survive. This is a material constraint. But a flat platform enlarges my opportunities. You, as a small company, you reach 70% of your customers through our matchmaking. You wouldn't have managed otherwise, so it's a win-win situation. What is your argument? Because a small company has more customers, Facebook has advertising income, customers find suitable companies, so we need platforms for that. Answer: to be forced to use those platforms. So being softly forced, the soft force of circumstances, as Karl Marx put it. Somebody who is an Uber driver, for instance, uses the platform to earn a crust, to earn a living. In Austria, there is a platform for care personnel, 100% women, non-Germans, not having an Austrian passport. They are freelancers. They are entrepreneurs. They need the platform in order to participate in the labor market and participate in society. Also Facebook, we know it all. You have to be on LinkedIn, on Facebook to advertise your wares. For the Ford worker, he was not interested. He didn't have to look after updating their own website. So I see a continual development. Twitter, some use it as an entry for a professional career as an influencer, for instance. It's a continuous development. Or the distinction is blurred between leisure time and work. In lots of biographies, the boundaries are blurred, are fuzzy. This is a privilege that I'm not forced to use a platform. And also in my environment, among my friends and relatives, they don't feel forced. Students, well, they see it as some social pressure, but not pressure for generating income. Those are different constraints. The peer-to-peer constraint that you, the peer-to-peer obligation that you want to participate, where the others are, FOMO, a fear of missing out. This fear is different than to feed my family. From an economic perspective, I think it's impressive to see when I use Google. It's very unfortunate that we don't have a sway of Google with us. With the search algorithm, they have created one of the most important algorithms, 60,000 searches per second. I spoke to the vice president of search at Republika. How many people work on this algorithm? Who maintains this algorithm? Who lubricates this algorithm? Billions of people use that machine, use that algorithm. And he said, about 14 people, 14 staff. So this relationship between 14 workers working on this algorithm and earning their living, and billions of people who feed the machines through their searches, through their activities, through the public character of the internet. From an economic perspective, as an economist, for me, it's not right to say, well, 14 people are being exploited, and for the others, it's fun. The awareness of this being a problem has grown in society. So this is like new infrastructure, something we need in society, and at the same time it generates a lot of profit. With the data, even more money was generated before the GDPR came into force. At the moment it's being discussed at an EU level with the Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act. A lot of political criticism, scientific criticism is now accepted. How would you describe it, Jeanette, what happens? Well, first there were teething problems. It was like the Wild West. The companies could do as they pleased with the data, but now we have come to a point where we develop towards a more reasonably regulated platform.
I wouldn't use the term reasonable, but there are always two goals for the EU. On the one hand, the platforms are to be regulated in a stronger way, but this is also about a standardization of regulation among member states. And the second goal is at least as important as the first. And that is the reason why we are usually disappointed with the final result, because the most neoliberal member states usually get their way. And that's the reason why it is so difficult to find a common ground in terms of regulation. So I believe what we're doing at the moment will only be the very first step, the initiation of a process that needs to further develop over the next 10 or 15 years, just as the platforms that will certainly evolve. So the things we're regulating today might not exist in future. Timo, what do you think? We see that platforms are not allowed to exploit their power in order to exclude some competitors or advertise for certain products. Would that change your view on digital capitalism? Would you then agree that we have reached the same level as we had in the past because they are now being regulated? Well, maybe let me say one thing first. I criticize digital capitalism, but I also admire the accomplishments that are behind these services and the accomplishments of these tech companies. So I do admire their work in a way. About the two aspects you raised, the standardization of regulations, I know that they are making a lot of progress at the moment. November 1st in China, a law was passed, and this law actually protects privacy and is in line or was inspired by the GDPR regulation. So this is an important innovation in terms of the digital industry, and I'm completely with you in terms of your first point. And what you said is also true, because it is based on a philosophy that says we want a market distortion. No, but we want to protect the customer. But after all, the GDPR reduces all of us to consumers with certain rights that must not be fooled by the platforms. But the fundamental principle of these platforms, which is to gather data for free on an incredible scale. Well, what is important is how they generate usable information. This is called data extractionism, compared to crude oil and raw data. And then this product is finished and finally sold. So there is this analogy with the extraction of oil. And here, GDPR is not enough. Are you referring to the digital market? No, I'm referring to the General Data Protection Regulation and follow-up laws, because they do not ban the way the capital is being reproduced by these tech platforms. You mentioned that briefly. After these times of the Wild West, these tech platforms actually agree with the regulations proposed by their governments. They're relieved to have regulations for them and to regulate the way they work, and that is also true for the Chinese digital market. Jeanette, in one of your articles, you mentioned the partial evolution of data to become part of society. What do you mean by that? I'd like to take a step back when it comes to the question of regulation. I talked to a lawyer who deals with competitive law, and she told me that based on the United States legal system, they always ask themselves whether the practice harms the consumers or not. And that is the most essential question that they use as a basis for the decision-making process. And that is something the European Union also uses in terms of regulating these platforms. So they always have to prove that these practices are harmful for us, but that is not possible on short notice. If you look at all the benefits thanks to Amazon, which is that we're able to order all kinds of stuff that will be sent to our apartment or house the next day, then that's perfect. Of course not when you look at the working conditions, but that again is the problem of labor law. So the question is it harmful for the consumers? And when you use that question, it is difficult to find arguments against Amazon and the like. On the long term, once Amazon will finally cause the elimination of different competitors, then there will be a long-term harm or long-term damage. But on the short term, it is very difficult to prove that. And we talk about proving things. I think that if we want to better regulate these platforms, we need to understand what exactly they're doing in the first place. In terms of regulation, we need access to the data they use and the analysis mechanism they use. That is even relevant today if the Deutsche Monopolkommission, Commission of Monopolies, if they criticize companies for abusing their power, then they gain access to their data. With the Digital Marketing Act, companies actually have to have a representative explaining this authority, which kind of data they use and how they analyze it. So I think step by step the legislators will open access to these data. But apart from that, companies should be forced to share the data because they do not belong to them with their competitors and with researchers. That's an entirely new way of looking at things. Thank you very much. I know that there are different laws being planned at the moment that say that researchers need to get access to this data, but it's not finalized yet. Well, I think we all have a bad feeling about the power concentration, but you mentioned the fact that it's very difficult to define the disadvantages for the user. Timo, you compare this to the Industrial Revolution, the capital, and when we think about the massive conflicts that evolved at the time, disadvantages of one group and wealth and prosperity of another group, how would you judge the current situation? Who is the winner here? I like this kind of comparison, and maybe I could even add something else. The limitations of the GDPR that do not really leave the laws of the market, well, that resembles the 8-hour working day, which was something the labor movement had fought for. Of course, there was a legitimate movement and really made an end to critical working situation, the Wild West, as I called it. So they introduced the 8-hour working day, which at the same time resulted in the fact that the exploitation, in the sense that Marx defined it, that an added value is created by paying workers, and that was sanctioned. And I believe that, and I would like to quote Mr. Suboff, Ms. Suboff, who published the book Surveillance Capitalism and said that by being active on these tech platforms, we create an increase in behavior, which then leads to an additional product that the platform can use again. And she really underlines the aspect we've also raised. The basic principle of these platforms cannot be changed. If you want the tech companies, the digital companies, to respect data privacy, then it would be like asking Henry Ford not to use the assembly line, but rather to have every car built by hand. So this is their core, their daily operation. Well, I would have loved to hear Svea's opinion on that. What do you think, Jeanette? These platforms also address such issues, don't they? If they would not have their monopoly, if these unfair principles were banned, what do you think? What would they do? In my opinion, this is a bit contradictory. Before you said the General Data Protection Regulation was the innovation in terms of regulation, and even China was inspired by that. But now you're telling us that data protection doesn't matter at all because these platform companies do whatever they want. Personally, I do not believe in the GDPR for a simple reason. This is always based on the individual, but opposed to that, we need developments that take everyone into consideration, and that would lead to the fact that not we as an individual would have to give our consent, but that it would rather work as a trade union, so that we would have the power as society to negotiate these regulations with the platforms. So I, as an individual who really needs a search engine, I have to give my consent to the privacy settings for Google. So I give my data to Google so that I can use this valuable service. In my opinion, that is an unfair constellation. And in my opinion, the GDPR gives us the freedom to give our consent or not is nonsense. And that is why I believe this is absolutely not up to date, and I really wish there was a new, better model. But what we have is the General Data Protection Regulation, and in my opinion, the problem is that the implementation is very poor, and the data protection authorities do not have sufficient capabilities in order to control whether everyone heeds these regulations or to even punish them. Well, actually, I believe there are many things we agree upon, especially the fact that we criticize that data protection only sees us as the owners of our data and as consumers, market subjects, and tries to protect us as such, but not as us as the owners of collective data, which is exactly the direction that we would have to follow up upon in future in order to find a good solution. As the 8-hour working day tried to regulate exploitation, we now have to come up with a solution for this amount of collective data and how to protect that and see it as a collective force of productivity, which it is. This becomes apparent in our pandemic, for example, sequencing or vaccine development, contact tracking. These are data operations that we as a society need in order to overcome this pandemic. And it would be even easier if we had open data as societies accessible for everyone. That's an interesting aspect, and I have some follow-up questions. But before I do so, I would like to ask the audience to ask their questions. I'm sure you have many questions because we already raised many interesting subjects. So if you wish to ask a question or if you want to make a comment, then please walk towards the microphone. And I'm sure that some questions have already come up from our virtual audience. I don't know which platform you're using. Actually, we're using Zoom. There's a question. The legislator should get deeper insights. But isn't it problematic if even more stakeholders have access to these data? You mean data protection would contradict the fact that these authorities would have access to these data? I do not think that this would be a problem. We discussed this in terms of communication platforms. They usually argue that the power of platforms can be seen because they are the public sphere, as more and more public debates happen on these communication platforms. And that is why these platforms that use ranking operations, that filter informations, have an influence in deciding which debates become relevant to the public and which debates remain unseen. So that's an interesting issue for regulation, and legislators should think about demanding more transparency from these platform companies. And as I said, this is not about individual users, but about the operations that platforms use to control and structure these flows of information. I would like to add something here. We talk about data portability, for example, whether there should be laws that say data should be easier to transfer from one platform to the other. And that's why we're able to download data, pictures, etc. on Facebook. The next step would be to establish interoperability. Shouldn't we have to define different formats that stipulate that content that is being generated on these platforms had to be identical, so that there would have to be interfaces? These are demands from those who are critical about these tech platforms, who disagree with the intransparency of these companies. But if you take a closer look, then you realize that wasn't really worthwhile and wasn't successful at all. A small startup that has a new idea risks being overtaken by a larger company that uses its data. This is also problematic in terms of open source softwares, especially large corporations really support open source, etc., because then they have access to everything we have. That becomes especially apparent when we talk about Google, Microsoft, and AI, because the platforms they use and where they offer AI-based services, where they offer this to everyone, make it accessible for everyone, and it becomes the industrial basis for everything, and every startup, small and medium-sized company can use it, and by doing so become part of the Microsoft or Facebook or Google universe. And by doing that, future prospects for Microsoft really have changed, because these monopolies increase even more in terms of their power. what are impacts for the focuses when it comes to developing AI-supported systems? We've talked about biases and a bias, but what can you tell us about different priorities for future projects? Especially because large platforms do have a lot of power and influence. I always try to think about this in terms of how can we make sure that AI is really used for the common good. And these AI developers, would you say this is a problem that our society has and that a better way of developing AI is not possible any longer? I'm not sure whether I agree with that, because we have many small companies that have started specializing in this area, and we do not know which projects survive. And I'm not sure whether I can already say something about that.
I have a somewhat darker opinion when we have a look at the companies which can recruit the most talent and spends billions on research and development, who has the best collection of data, has the best results, like autonomous driving, speech recognition, image recognition. It's the digital groups, the digital companies which have been around for 20 years. There is a lively digital landscape, but still to turn AI in a productive machine, only the Silicon Valley companies manage, and the Chinese companies. You hear that from scientists. They go to Alibaba because they have the most data, and that's where research is more interesting. So there as well, as far as AI research and implementation is concerned, the American-Chinese expert Kai-Fu Lee calls it the age of implementation we live in. So there is this pull towards the big companies. This is how I see it. Question: in the analog space and virtual space, things have happened. So let's start with the analog space. Okay, Vincent reads the questions from the chat.
Hans schreibt, sind aber entsprechende auswertenden Algorithmen auf eine Art einsehbar, dass ein von den
Is it possible to see the algorithms so that basic understanding of algorithms is possible? What was the question again? Please, a bit more slowly. The evaluating algorithms, are they open so that independent understanding of the data is possible? Answer: that is a very good question. I published a paper on this recently. The demand for more transparency concerning algorithms is what we looked into, and our findings were that that is rather naive, as AI-based systems like machine learning are so dynamic that it is very difficult to lay that open, to publish that, because data sets continually change and the use of algorithms is so distributed. It's difficult to point your finger at what you want to know, to pinpoint what you want to know. Our findings were, we take it, every industry will need their own techniques of transparency. We have to adopt the capacity to understand AI-based systems. That will need different skills from different fields in order to be able to evaluate the situation. And regulatory aspects will have to be organized in line, and that cannot happen overnight. This is an ongoing learning process which will be quite demanding for regulatory bodies. So it sounds like more work for government watchdogs. Well, yes, that is true. It's not just a black box you can open. That is certainly true. Speaking of black boxes, there is a nice text by Stanislaw Lem, the Polish science fiction author, who has used this black box metaphor. And I think it's quite unusual reaction. And he said a light switch is also a black box. We don't really know what's behind it, what the cable routing is behind it, but we see what the function is. A somewhat provoking question. So opening black boxes, verifying how AI works, is that too much to ask? Maybe we should assess the results like a light switch. Is the light on or off? And for a black box, we could see, is this application discriminating against somebody? Does it deliver what we want to have? Can we verify that in tests? And it will get a hallmark or a test seal, and that's it. Doing spot checks or random checks are counterproductive, or are not useful. Those systems develop dynamically, hence machine learning. We always look at algorithms, but what is important is the training set, which continuously develops. We need to develop observation skills, which are used all the time. And this idea of an MOT hallmark, so to speak, is from a different century, sort of a certification label. That may be true for a car, which you use for 3 years, but it's not sufficient to understand what systems do. And also the question is, who is looking, who needs to have that information? Because I, as a user, don't have a look inside my car. A mechanic does it. Mechanic makes sure whether everything is in good working order. And for AI, it also makes a difference who has the skills. For instance, if you apply for a bank loan and that's turned down, you are immediately affected. And in line with new legislation, you have a right to know why your loan application has been turned down. But will I be able to assess that, is the question, or will there be experts who can have a closer look? Because there is a big gap. Bank clerks may not be able to do it either, Ms. Hofmann is saying. In the previous panel, you were on the previous panel as well, we had an example from France. I think you brought it up about judges, where it was seen that judges in France, after lunch, pass less strict sentences than before lunch. So, hence the idea of mine. Here we know, due to the data, something has gone awry, something is wrong. Without looking inside the judges' minds, we know from the results here discrimination has happened and we have to do something. Hence the idea of a black box. Ms. Hofmann, we cannot imagine a world free of discrimination. It's a nice experiment was done using the Compass software, which is used to measure the recidivism among former criminals. Different criteria were applied in order to come to a fair sentence, and the result was this piece of software cannot come up to all requirements of fairness, and the judges' sentences cannot do that either. Hence the example. Nowadays, we have requirements coming from automation. We have requirements for freedom of discrimination and justice, which we have never made on people. We evaluate the activities of people based on what we want to ask a machine to do. That is great. Max Weber, the great sociologist, put it as follows. when he talked about the performative activities of a judge, comparing it to a machine. So the law is the algorithm, the data are the concrete case, and then the judge is a machine. And the French judge is to pass an objective sentence, whether she's hungry or not. So the AI raises expectations, and we want to reflect which decisions have been taken for what reason. Two analog questions, apparently. This comparison of black boxes, the behavioral approach. You look at behavior and behavior. Well, self-driving cars, autonomous cars. We have lots of different companies which develop their technology at the same time and in parallel. When you look into the black box, you find other black boxes, so lots of AI systems in those companies which communicate with each other, so it's highly intransparent. I would like to ask a question from a regulatory perspective. What is more likely? What is the more likely scenario? All those competing car companies that the OEMs have to prove what is the decision-making processes in their cars, or that you run tests on a test track. In difficult cases, will the car run over the pedestrian or not? In conclusion, you may come to a conclusion, regulation cannot be handled for so many OEMs. Maybe one system prevails, and Google is the company producing the most reliable system. So maybe regulation would be overtaxed. What system will prevail? What do you think? Answer: if you ask me, conventions will be formed which come from regulatory requirements, but also from court cases when people sue. I think that will be certain that there will be court cases. People will sue. There was a car accident where an autonomous car, a Tesla, had an accident. That was in California. It was a rear-end accident. Somebody died, and apparently the car didn't recognize the lane markings, and the lane markings had changed. And Tesla's argument was, when we built the car, we didn't have that kind of lane marking. And you see how complex that is, how complex court cases like that will be. Prosecution and defense. What will the car company have to be done in order to rule out cases like that? What is state of the art? What can be expected of them? So there will be lots of negotiations, court cases, people suing with surprising results. But the bottom line will be that the sign of quality will be, does the number of accidents go down, yes or no? AI systems never aim for the perfect solution, but only approximations. It's always threshold values which are defined when training systems. They may be at 93%, 98%, but it's never about the perfect solution. And I take it that the actual companies are satisfied with such high threshold values, and the rest is just costs they have to shoulder if there are accidents. This sounds like very much of a problem. Timo, will they achieve a certain rate of accidents or faults where you can expect that this technology will remain ethical? Answer: that's very interesting what you said. Hence, you see, you cannot really open the black box and understand what's going on. So this kind of threshold. I think legislation on autonomous driving, which was passed in Germany at the beginning of this year. It says, and this is about public transport, so it's not about Tesla, and so the perpetuation of a private car. This is about fleet customers, part of public transport, public traffic. And this is to adopt a situation with the lowest risk. So this is trailblazing. This is the law in Germany, showing the compromise. We want to be very safe. We want to be very conservative. We want to go on the hard shoulder when there are dangers. But it's not 100%. Nobody can guarantee that. AI regulation coming from Brussels aims at different categories of risk, and very pragmatic solutions are being found. You have to define what is the risk, what is the context, and then they get down to the nitty-gritty of it. And the requirements are in line with different categories of risk. Now, apparently, questions are pouring in. We are about to close 2 offline questions, and you are using the mic. Okay, that colleague over there was first, and then apparently another online question. I have a question about the necessity for regulation. And this definition that the question behind this is it harmful for consumers? So this antitrust or competition regulation. Isn't that a bit short-sighted when ecological and economic consequences are not included? Because that doesn't harm a consumer, but the destruction of the environment would be harmful for consumers. And another question, and we answered the questions at the same time. You have just said there are now the same requirements for behavior free of discrimination, like for judges, which we also try and apply to AI. I understood it in a negative way, so I wonder, don't we have to understand first where discrimination happens in society and how does that work in order to enable machine learning free of discrimination? It's not that AI under its own steam imposes discrimination. It learns from a discriminating society, so we have to start there. Where does discrimination happen in society? In order to look into it, study that, and in order for us to know which data have to be supplied to an algorithm and what do we have to do in order to prevent discrimination. And a third question. Thank you, Florian. 2 questions, in fact. May asks, there is no obligation to use the products of tech companies. But aren't you forced in a way to use Apple Pay and PayPal, or to use video conferencing for social participation? And the second question, MB asked, if the algorithms for data analysis were open, the risk would be that the algorithms could be used in a targeted way. In which way should algorithms be disclosed? Would an abstract description be sufficient? And I would have a remark myself as well, but that's for later. Whatever later means, Florian is saying. So I will watch over it, that you answer every question. Antitrust law or competition law, what are the requirements? I didn't say that I like it that you define it in such a way. What this antitrust lawyer said the competition lawyer said that was a tendency over the last couple of years to define competition problems in that way. Is it harmful for consumers, yes or no? And the hurdle to become active is much higher, the threshold is much higher. This kind of definition of antitrust problems doesn't make it easy to regulate platforms. So I think we need to change our understanding of competition law so that it can become active again. I'm always interested in undesired side effects. The irony of criticism of algorithms is, well, our requirements on people, where we know they act subjectively and that we have machine-like requirements for them. I think this is very ironical of criticism of AI. Well, discrimination is an issue everywhere. You have to define that and where it comes from. Discrimination, that is. So, are you forced to use technology, and is it a problem when algorithms are disclosed? Can it be a problem? Yes, we have touched upon that when we talked about open source. We see it with all digital groups. Tesla has disclosed all their patents a few years ago. In capitalism, that is daft. But with this platform logic, which is about upscaling or economies of scale, from Tesla's point of view, their view is electric powertrains will prevail. Well, then it makes sense. There are lots of examples. For instance, the Google search algorithm is available online. It's based on a work of Larry Page and Sergey Brin in Stanford. So there are not so many secrets. There has been a shift in recent years in science and in criticism of the platforms. So it's not that they protect their business secrets. They have such a power over infrastructure, well, that they can disclose their codes. They are in such a powerful situation, which is not the monopoly over the code. And another remark, regulation, which is limited because it sees human beings as consumers. Well, that was our golden thread today. I think this is an interesting debate, just like the debate about the 8-hour day. Our colleague has just mentioned it. Basic problems of growth in capitalism, be it industrial or digital capitalism or destruction of the environment or exploitation of labor, we will not achieve that by regulation and shorter working hours, but with a criticism of capitalism. To understand how added value is produced, the understanding is very important in order to criticize platforms in a general way. Jeanette Hofmann is saying, how much should you disclose of the algorithms? I think that is a correct question. If you were to disclose it all, there would be a danger of gaming the system. It's nice. Well, if you are confronted with recommendation algorithms, you try to understand their logic. I do it all the time with Spotify. I listen to certain pieces in order to prevent a situation that the following week I hear too much music of one kind rather than another. So I have an active intervening relationship with algorithms which do something for me. If it were all disclosed, well, that there would be a danger that algorithms are manipulated in such a way that they couldn't do their work anymore. It's a good example of adversarial AI, Spotify. We have to conclude. There is one question after all. Jeanette, you are a trailblazer of internet research. The euphoria at the beginning that you have information space. where democracy can be fleshed out in a different way, where matchmaking happens and lots of functionalities. Has digital capitalism destroyed that, or is there a future? Where do you see the future? Can it be used in an optimum way? What is your approach? This would be lopsided. This would be one-sided. I don't quite see it through rose-tinted glasses. In the mid-90s, I was extremely euphoric, but I learned a lot, and I've changed my opinion. For me, if you were to imagine a life without the internet, only very few people would desire that. There are huge benefits due to the internet. Almost everybody has access to information, and the benefit is huge. I agree with you as far as the criticism is concerned that we pay with our personal data, but the fact that we can use platforms and search engines without having to pay for that, I think that is great, and I will defend that because it provides access for people to those services which otherwise couldn't afford those services. In Latin America, people have just access to Facebook and very selective populist media. It has terrible consequences, negative consequences. So we have to be careful about regulation, and something like network neutrality, which provides access to lots of information sources, that is extremely important. So it does matter how we regulate the internet. Timo agrees, but what does that mean in practical terms?
Actually, I hope that these were the last and final words, but I would like to be an advocate for the fact that it really helped democratize our society. And I think that would be a great way of closing this discussion. I agree with you. Thank you very much for this fascinating panel discussion. Thank you to the audience for raising your questions. Enjoy the rest of the evening and see you after the break.